You're listening to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast, a show where your hosts, Derry and Ethan, discuss the controversial topics often avoided by the church. They also discuss culture, society, and everyday goofs. And now, Derry and Ethan.
We're back.
What's up, everybody? You heard it from the man himself. It's Ethan and Derry, the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, talking about the gray areas of the Christian faith that maybe often get neglected. And you have questions, and we want to have answers.
Yeah.
Holding firm to biblical truth, while also understanding that maybe the things that we heard before aren't the best. You know, maybe they're not the most accurate.
Mm-hmm. Maybe things we're hearing now also aren't the best.
Yeah.
And things of old are better. You know?
Yeah.
There's lots of things that are like that just as well that are the flippity flop of that. So
Yeah.
we got a lot of things to dive into. This is a juicy episode that I'm really excited about.
Yes, sir.
We got a little bit of stuff to say about it, but I think we're going to probably go on some tangents and some rabbit trails most likely. Talk about some interesting stuff. So today we're talking about the church. You know, it's something that we've talked about a lot before in the past. You know, it seems like for the last 5 to 10 years, it's been a really hot button issue to talk about how the church should change and, you know, should we just go to like an all-house church model, or like how should we redesign or reevaluate, rethink the church, you know? And there's so many different churches that have rebranded and done all this kind of stuff and changed formats and changed layouts and changed even leadership structures and stuff like that. Most churches now, it seems like the biggest change they made was like adding home groups or life groups, is what they call it, in like 10 years ago or 15 years ago or whatever, to try to sort of decentralize the church as much as they could, you know what I mean? Kind of having like house churches while still coming together as a church. And I know in the past we've done full episodes on this topic of what should the church look like and how should, like, what did the biblical church look like? And not even necessarily what did the biblical church look like, but what is that model that they had then, and how does it translate to the society we live in now, right? We've done full episodes about that. But today, instead of talking about that necessarily again, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, we wanted to sort of talk about how the church is criticized, because it seems like we criticize the church of old as if it is the church that still exists now, when we've made significant advancements as a church, but we're still thinking about it the same way. So is there anything you want to say, or do you want me to jump in and talk about and explain what we're going to go over?
Yeah, maybe just for one, my understanding, but also in clarification, but also maybe if the audience needs clarification. When you say the church of old, how old do you mean?
Yeah. So I mean, like 15 years ago, before we started like making changes, right?
Okay.
Because the thing that we tried to get away from, it feels like, over the last 15 years, was the idea of the church being an organization, and we've tried to get away from that. And you know, people always say, you know, the body where two or more are gathered, and it's always like we try to emphasize that all the time, where it doesn't actually mean anything to us anymore. And I think our mindset has stayed the same in the church being an organization, even though we try to change a lot of the practices of it being an organization, if that makes sense.
Right.
So while in practice, we've tried to get away from us viewing and even mostly speaking about the church as an organization, and, you know, changing that speech to be, you know, this is the body, we are the church, and then we're the church gathered in a building, not that the building is the church, right? We've changed all this language and kind of driven it home to everybody for so long, in trying to get people to realize that it's not an organization, but a people group, right? Mm-hmm. We've done that for so long, but I don't think our mindset has changed, because the church is just somewhere we still go and gather on Sundays, right? Yeah. And the church still has sort of a hierarchical like structure to it, where we look to pastors as like the main spiritual leaders, which they are spiritual leaders, right? But we don't look to anybody really in the community as that same kind of person.
And maybe we shouldn't. You know?
Maybe we also should. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Depending on the level of education, of course.
Right.
And so I think there's ways in that we talk about the church not being an organization, but we still view it in our minds and even in a lot of our actions as still being an organization. So the thing that made me think about this topic was, you know, there's whole like Instagram accounts that are dedicated to just criticizing the church. Not maybe in fullness dedicated to that, but, you know, a lot of them dedicated to deconstruction that are Christian accounts also. I was watching a story of one account that's not dedicated to that, but just dedicated to undoing some of the the ways we've thought in the past, but they also do a lot of like memes and comedy and stuff. The account's called Christians Who Curse Sometimes.
Yeah, they're great.
An amazing account, right?
They're great. I love them.
And they were doing a Q&A or something like that on sex, which they do all the time. I'd highly recommend going and checking them out. They have a lot of really good content. So they're doing this Q&A on sex, and the way the guy who runs the page does it, and he also might be on the podcast later too. He's a really cool guy. He said he'd come on.
That'd be really exciting.
Yeah, but might be for a little bit. Might not be for a couple months. The way he runs it is he tells everybody what they're going to be talking about, right? And then he presents a couple of polls to get the audience's reaction to a question, right? And then he does a question and answer thing where he puts like the question box and lets people send in questions about the topic, and then he posts people's questions with polls underneath them, and that's kind of the way he does it. And then he brings an expert on to answer all those questions afterwards. And so in the beginning of section of this, he's talking about sex, and he puts out a poll and the poll says, do you feel like the church did a good job teaching you about sex growing up, right? And that's like the poll. And it's like 70 or 80% said like, no, the church didn't do a good job like teaching me about sex, right? And I think it's a fact most of the time that, most people don't have the best sex education growing up, right? And it's also super controversial. It has been for a long time, conservatives in sex education in school, and it's been a problem before. So 80% of people said, or 80% of people said that they didn't feel like the church did a good job teaching them this. And I just had this thought immediately of, why do we feel like the church hasn't done a good job teaching us about sex? And I thought, I never have heard a sermon just about sex from the pulpit. Mm-mm. Like maybe it had to do with sex, or the pastor referenced sex, or a time he told a story about sex one time or something like that to be funny.
Or the newly married youth pastor.
Yeah, they make jokes about it. So like it is mentioned, right? But I thought to myself, like, why would I even ever hear a sermon in church about sex? I've heard little things about it, but why would that be necessary for me to hear from the pulpit? There's a lot of things that don't necessarily need to be necessary for you to hear from the pulpit, or that I had never even heard from the pulpit. But I thought to myself, like, if the church like is not an organization and it's just everybody that is a Christian, then asking this question, like I was framing this question and thinking about it in the means of, have I ever heard this in the church building? And I thought, I'm thinking in a sense of the church as an organization, and I know that question was also framed in the sense of the church as an organization, and did the church building and like in that place on Sundays or Wednesdays or whenever, did they teach you about sex in there, right? And I was thinking, like, in two ways, we shouldn't think like that, but also, like, we shouldn't limit all of the times we think about the church to just being that building. Like, I answered the question, and I was like one of the like 19 or like whatever percent that said, at the time when I answered the poll, it was 90%, that said that yes, the church did do a good job of teaching me about sex, because I did grow up with a good sex education, because my parents, I think, taught me well, and I also like had lots of mentors and lots of people that I could talk to about it and stuff like that. So it wasn't a big deal for me. Like, I knew everything that I needed to know. I knew the science behind it. I knew a lot of people's experiences. I had a lot of testimonies. I'd heard all these things. And of course there's like, some misinformation that you get here and there. Like, there's just normal, you're going to hear stories as a kid, and kids like telling fake stories and stuff like that all the time. But I said yes, like I had a good sex education. Even though I had never heard that story from inside of the church, I knew that I had a good education, because I knew that Christians had raised me to know what sex was, and like know how to do it and what's healthy about it, and all the like statistics about it and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And so the church, to me, as the people of God, had taught me about sex. And so I answered that poll honestly and said that I did have a good sex education. And I think if people would think about the church in that way more, then they would have answered the poll the same way that I did. Because I would answer the poll and say no if I was just thinking about the building, right? And so that got me thinking about this topic of how often do we think about the church as an organization and even in action, treat the church as an organization, when we've so hard tried to change the wording and even our thinking about the church being a people group. Yes. I can keep going, but is there anything you want to say?
I got opinions. My phone is just glitching out here. So yeah, the big idea that we're talking about is people blame the church as an organization or an institution for failing them in certain areas, right? And the question is, well, why are we even looking at the church as this organization, as this institution, right? Because you're right, we shouldn't. Ideally, that would not be something that would cross our mind. We wouldn't think of the church and equate it to this institutionalized structure. But it's what it's become, right? And so the problem, I don't blame people for like calling the church an institution or acting like it is, because that's what it has become.
Right, that's what we treat it.
It's not supposed to be like that. It wasn't like that from the onset of Christianity, and in most of the world, I would say it's not like that. It's only in Western countries where we have this. It's only where
Sometimes, yeah.
like in the Middle East, their churches are like small groups, like what we would consider small groups. In China, their churches are underground small groups. And other parts of like all over where Christianity is not dominant, it's more small groups, which makes sense. It's not dominant. There's less people, but also what they have, the model they have is like a few, maybe like 8 to 10 people, 12 people in a house. And then if it gets bigger than that, they go to another house. Right. And that seems to be, as we can see in the Bible, maybe a better version of what the church could be. And so had the church in America been like this, or if it had ever been like this in the past, I don't think it's like that. With small groups, we're trying, but it's not working really, because you're still you can still meet. It's not a problem to meet corporately, but when you have cell groups, it's not like maybe always like one person, leading, or you don't look to that person as your pastor, and you're usually just going over what was done on Sunday morning, not like a new teaching of scripture, in my experience.
Yeah.
And so the reason people look at the church as an institution is because that's what it's become. It's become this thing that is like a corporate job where they are run by like corporations. Like I've worked in churches, and it's very much like, in my experience, it's been very much like a corporation where like I work for this person's under this person's under this, and the pastor's under the eldership.
And there's a hierarchy, yeah.
Yeah, which is good. Church leadership should have hierarchy. It's not all like everyone's under the pastor. But the idea of
controversial
being, that's biblical. We have elders and deacons in the early church, and pastors. But what I was saying is, like when you get to churches, and like the churches I've gone to, like 2,000 people, 3,000 people when I was going there, that's not the best setting for a church. Maybe churches should max out at 100 people or less, depending on who you talk to, about what their experiences and stuff like that is. And so I think this idea that like, oh, the church failed me here, the church failed me in this area, or I wasn't taught by the church in this
area.
What's that?
Area.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
Area.
That's area.
I think that's a valid statement. It's an unfortunate statement, and I wish that the institution that the church has become would teach better. I think we can own up to that and say, yeah, we should have a healthier talk about certain subjects. We should we should talk in a more serious way about mental health. We should talk more serious about, I think, about sex ed. I think what would be really cool is if we started talking, and maybe we started, but a lot of people say like, oh, you're a sinner, get saved, you need to do this, yada yada. But what if instead of like talking about how bad people are, what if we talk about like how good God is? The Bible talks about, and we do that in a sense, but it's like we just obsess with like the goodness of God and how He lavishes. Because I would say my experience, I was given to this idea that like if I made a mistake, God was this angry God who's just bringing down judgment. And I've been trying to unlearn that for the last couple of years of like, oh no, like Isaiah said that He's promised to never be angry with me. He deals with me on a basis of mercy. He has only love for me. He's not angry with me. And I've had to unlearn a lot of these things that I was living out of. So just thinking about that, just spitballing. But yeah, the church, when the people say the church failed me in this, it's like, I'm sorry, that happened. Yeah, I see it. Now, had the church been more of a home group that you went to where you could ask questions about it, and maybe this home group consisted of young families and older people who were grandparents maybe, and other single people, or maybe dating people, like it consisted of people from all walks of life, all studying the scriptures together, maybe under one person, whoever like hosted it, or someone that God has called to shepherd, Had you been in that setting and you asked these questions, I would say you probably more likely would have gotten a better experience of the teaching of it, whatever the question might be, because smaller groups create a safer atmosphere for relationship, and you see the person and the struggles rather than just a person with a question about a subject.
Yeah.
You know, it personalizes people when it's a smaller setting. So I think when we talk about this, I think that the biggest thing that could fix it is reforming the church to be like a small group. You know, basically, there's like rabbit churches and elephant churches. Have you heard of that before? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for you guys who haven't heard that before, a rabbit church, you know, like rabbits are really small and they go everywhere and they reproduce really, 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 really fast. And so they just kind of are really small and they spread like crazy and they move really fast. Versus an elephant who moves pretty slow, is really big but moves pretty slow. Still powerful, but still moves slow and doesn't reproduce as much, right? And so that's the idea. If you have like in the Bible Belt, they have a lot of churches of like X amount of thousands of people, right? But maybe they get to like 10,000 and then maybe they split to 5,000. Maybe both those get to 10,000 and maybe they split again, you know? Versus if you had a church got to 10,000, you split up into 1,000 churches of 100 people. Is that my right math? Or 10? 10 churches of 100 people? Mm-hmm. 10 churches of 100 people. Ha, that's why I'm in ministry and not a mathematician.
1,000?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have like small, like 10 churches each at 100 people. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you do like 20 churches at 50 people, you know, something like that. And you see how then all those smaller churches can be more inviting to the people around them and then give the better context. I think maybe I'm off topic, but all of this to say a church that is focused on staying small but reproducing a lot under proper authority and having those authorities of those churches under more authority, so there's always accountability, I think would do a better job. And then this idea of the church being an institution, quote unquote, would probably not be as like held as strong because they would realize the church is a people group. You know, the church is never supposed to be an institution. The church is primarily a people group. We are, and as the Bible talks about it, we're like how like you come to America and become American. You become a Christian and you become in the kingdom of God. We are a people group. We are like a nation of priests, as Peter talks about it. You know, and so although we don't have any land that we own like countries do, we are a people group that occupy every land in the world. And so we shouldn't be looked at as an institution. We should be looked at as a people group. And for us Christians, we need to start acting like that more than we do. Like, oh, I just go to church and I'm a Christian. It should be like, oh no, I'm a Christian, so I act in accordance with the laws of the kingdom of God, because that's my real home, not like laws of America, the laws of Mexico, or the laws of Canada, or the laws of wherever you live.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to shift the conversation though more to, because we could talk about all day like how do we do things better, and churches have done that for a long time, and you know where do we put more resources into, and how do we change the structure. But I think the change that needs to take place is not within the size of the small group or the size of the church or anything like that. I think that can take care of itself within the certain society that it's within. But I think the thing that needs to change is we love as human beings to, and this is why we love organizations, or the church being an organization, we love to put the responsibility on someone else and say, okay, the church, this building is not doing a good job with all of these things, right?
Shifting.
Instead of taking ownership and saying, I wasn't there for my brother or sister when they were going through their like bout with depression, or I wasn't there when this person needed to learn about sex ed, or like I didn't do something as the church that needed to be done. I didn't like stand up for this person, or I didn't take responsibility in this way, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we could even shift responsibility into like small groups, right? And still just have it be a thing like, oh, this church didn't do a good job like at this thing, when really it should just be like, we as the people, the answer to this problem, I think, is we as the church taking ownership and saying, I am the church. And when the church doesn't do something good, that means I didn't do something good. Right? And then I can start doing something differently. And then that means I take ownership and I start changing, and I start like teaching people, and I start like acting like Christ more. Yeah. And I start taking responsibility, whether that means I'm going to a church of 1,000 people or 100 people, whatever the situation looks like. It never is an organization, because I'm taking responsibility for the church, because that's me. Right? I am the church. And so I'm taking responsibility for the actions of my people. Right? And of course you can still say like it's a people group, and there's going to be people within the people group that don't do a good job. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to bear the blame for that kind of a thing, but I'm saying when we take ownership of the church as the church, it will then cease to be an organization we blame for things and start to just be a people group because of how our mindset has changed about the church, right? Because our actions with like viewing the church that way and taking ownership of it, we'll start to change our actions. We'll start to change how we interact with the society. We'll stop waiting for the church to serve us or to teach us, or to go out and feed that homeless person, or to go be a part of this nonprofit organization or something like that. And we'll start doing it ourselves. We'll start sending people out to go be a part of those organizations, to go clean up the streets, or to help people that are addicted to drugs, or whatever it is. We'll go start doing those things ourselves, and we'll say it's the church because we're the people of God, the church, right? And the church is doing that. Not that an organization is doing that, but that we, the people, are going and doing that thing as the church, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the sort of the mindset like kind of needs to shift. Because we could read 1.5 million verses in the Bible. Let me just I can just go to the Bible app and just read, look up the word church.
Don't fact check us on that. There's not even 1.5 million verses in the Bible.
Yeah.
So, don't do that.
I was going to say something blasphemous.
There's a fun fact. I think about 30,000 Bible verses in the Bible. So, do with that what you will.
I just accidentally looked up the word Bible because I'm so tired. Church is hard to look up. First off, a little bit of history, on the word church. I don't think it was created until around the 1200s, I believe. Originally, the word was just gathering, or gathering of believers, right? And they started translating that word to mean it starts with a K, but I don't know how to pronounce it. They just changed it to mean church, right? And that slowly became the organization we view now. But of course, at the beginning, church was just the word that was used for Christians that are gathering, right? And it wasn't good. It was good. So it's not that I don't think the word church is good. It's just kind of what it's associated with now. I don't think we should get rid of it necessarily. We should get rid of the connotation of it being an organization, is what I'm trying to say. But that's what the word used to mean. Okay, so we're just going to read, let me just read all these verses that came up when I looked it up in the Bible app. The first one, Hebrews 10:25, not neglecting to meet together, as in the habit of some, but encouraging one another. And then the second one, the list is Acts 2:42, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers, Acts 2:46. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, Acts 2:47, praising God and having favor with all people, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were saved. And there's many, many verses that keeps going down on and on and on if you were looking at the video. But, none of those talked about an organization or a governmental agency or anything like that, right? They talked about people that were gathering together and that were doing life together, that were learning together, that were teaching together, that were eating together, and there was people being added to their number, right, in all those verses. So I think it just reinforces the Bible talks about, the church being a people group, and we need to take the responsibility for that instead of putting the blame and the responsibility on an organization, taking that responsibility and saying, okay, we as a church are going to be better, and we as a church are not going to say anymore, oh, the church did a bad job at this. We're going to say, oh, we did a bad job at this, right? And take responsibility and start to do better as ourselves and take ownership of it. That's what I want to say on the topic.
Nice. Yeah, I love that a lot. I really like the idea of, taking ownership ourselves, because that's how it's going to change, right? If all of us took ownership, everyone listening to this podcast decided tomorrow, or even after this podcast, we're going to take ownership for what it means to be the church. If there's blame shift on the church, then I'm going to take that blame and I'm going to be a conduit of change, And then you changing, people would see that, and then they might change themselves, or your influence would cause them to change, right? And it would just be this thing that would spread, where if everyone's taking ownership, then we all heal together.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
and a lot more gets done because it activates people, right?
Yeah.
That's a very charismatic term. But it genuinely does activate people and motivates them to do something, because say I'm in charge of picking up all the trash on the street, right? And then one day, I walk out, I'm like, what? There's trash everywhere on the street, right? I'm like, why didn't the trash man come and pick up this trash, right? and it's my responsibility to pick up that trash anyway. Like, it's all of our responsibility on the block to like pick up the trash or whatever. And it's no longer like about some organization to pick up the trash. We take responsibility for it, and we start to change, and we start to take ownership of it, because it's no longer someone I can blame to do it. It's just mine. And so when it's mine, I take ownership of it. I even take pride and joy in it. I start to make it like what my life is about. And now it's who I am. You know, I'm a Christian. It's not that I go to church at a building, but it's that it's who I am. And it's everything that I am, and it's what I take ownership of, and all of the teachings of Christ, and how I'm supposed to act, and what I'm supposed to obey, and how people are supposed to see me, and all those kind of things. What I'm supposed to be learning, what I'm giving my time and energy to, is that I am a Christian, and I'm doing the things that a Christian would do in accordance to the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. And that changes everything about me. And I can no longer blame shift anything onto the church as an organization, but I have to take responsibility myself. I said the same thing over and over, and now we can end.
All right. Well, guys, thanks for listening and tuning in again. We hope you had a wonderful day. Hope you have a wonderful Wednesday or Thursday, whenever you're listening to this, Friday. Be blessed. Go out and share the gospel with someone. The kingdom of God is a joyous place to live, and we want everyone to live there. Excuse me. Follow us on all the social medias except Facebook, because that is not used by anyone anymore.
Or you'd be the first one.
Yeah, you might be the first one.
We got a lot of followers, but
maybe we'll give you a shout out if you follow us on Facebook.
Yeah.
Because we don't use Facebook.
Yeah.
But there's a Patreon if you want to support this ministry and be part of reaching, hopefully one day, millions of people in the world. We're in the early beginnings, and we think God only wants to take this farther. If you want to follow us on TikTok and be inspired and maybe get some laughs depending on what we do there, or Instagram, same thing. Twitter, do we do Twitter?
No.
We don't do Twitter either. So Facebook or Instagram, Twitter, Patreon, go there, support the show, share it with your friends, and thank you guys, and have a great night or day.
Goodbye.